trying to start a philosophy podcast, and we start with the one that references the most philosophy. Oh my god, dude, yeah.
You are listening to a podcast created by the Jacksway Collective, a podcast where 20-somethings put their mighty undergrad degrees to use by having laid-back academic discussions about philosophy, short stories, and whatever else we so choose. Today, we talk about Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, but before that, the guys discuss the ways in which homeless people use differing strategies to get us to give them money. Let's get to the show.
Honestly, the fucking Blue Yeti would introduce more problems than it would solve, as you know.
The Blue Yeti.
Jesus Christ, man. Did you ever think of a name?
No, I haven't come up with one yet.
Yeah, I haven't put any thought into it at all. I figured we just wing it the first time around, and then
I feel like it might be good to like get a few up there, and then just get in the habit of recording and stuff before branding.
Yeah, exactly. That's where you could totally get thrown off the rails, right? You do all this fucking prep work, and then you never actually make the fucking product, right?
Yeah.
So I have no expectations. This was a fucking hard-ass book to read. Yeah. Oh, my God.
Did you finish the whole book?
No. Just up to page 65 or 64. So just read Absurd Reasoning. I don't know where to start. I don't know where to go. But I have to ask you this before we get into it. So let me throw a little bit of I don't know. I guess you could call it philosophy. I don't know, man. But the other day, or I guess this was maybe 2 weeks ago now, I was with Tina and we were just driving to her place, and there was a homeless man who was standing at the stoplights, and he was kind of coming up to you out your window at the stoplight and asking you for money, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure you've encountered this.
Yeah, in Toronto.
And I'm sure you've encountered the whole spectrum. The ones that will come up and wash your windows, the ones that will, the whole fucking spiel. Everyone's got their own ways of dealing with it. So, putting aside the question of whether or not you should give money to a homeless person, I don't think that's that interesting of a question. I'm much more interested in whether or not we should be rewarding the Machiavellian style homeless people who go out of their way to get money for you, as opposed to the ones who just sit on the side of the road. Because the way that I see it, like, should we really be rewarding the ones that are
don't do anything?
Well, no, I was going to say the opposite. Should we be rewarding the ones that use social psychology to kind of manipulate you into giving them money, i.e. through washing your windows, or even just the most easy distinction? I see this all the time. You'll see the homeless people who sit against the building with a cup in their hand, like a standard homeless person who doesn't say anything, versus the ones who will lay down in the middle of the sidewalk, right? And so just take that and then imagine an entire spectrum of homeless people. Should we be rewarding the ones more that are, going out of the way to try and maybe manipulate you? I don't know if that's the right word, into giving you money. What do you think about that?
Trying to think here.
Yeah, it's a tough. I don't know. I don't have a firm answer on this.
I guess we're so, work is so ingrained in us that we feel inclined to give them their due when they do things like wash our car and shit.
Yeah, they're putting in a little bit of work towards you, right?
Yeah.
I guess the washing the car one is the only one that maybe doesn't fall on the spectrum that nice, because that's kind of like the free gift technique.
Yeah.
Right? But what about the ones that just walks up to the side of your car? Would you be more likely to give it to him? Or, of course, you would be more likely to give it to him because he's using these psychological tricks to get you to give money to him.
Guilting you into...
Yeah. But ought we give it to him is the question.
Yeah, I don't know.
And then even take the case of, you're walking down the street and you have one very quiet person who's just so desolate and sitting there stranded with his cup, versus the person who's laying sprawled out in the middle of the road. That's certainly intentional, right? There's no doubt about that, because you would feel more bad for the person who's spread eagle in the middle of the fucking sidewalk, right? Like, it's such a tough call, because part of me is like, yeah, okay, they're making some sort of active effort to engage with you. But the other part is like, I think that how they act as a homeless person probably has to do with their kind of individual differences in personality. Which
maybe they've just like given up. Maybe they were at one point playing hardball and then they've just given up.
Mm-hmm, exactly, which would make me be more likely to reward the people who work the least, right?
Yeah.
So I'm so torn on this, man. I don't know where I come down on it. It's a really, really fucking tough call.
Yeah. Some people are like don't give money to homeless people because they actually like kind of do well doing that.
Yeah.
That's what some people say.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Have you seen those videos online, right, where the one person's begging for money and then they get caught on camera like walking into their vehicle or something like that later? So of course you got to look out for them, right? Of course you have to look out for those types of people. I asked Tina the same thing. She gave me a kind of the cold economic perspective, and she's like, in a way, like all of these homeless people are competing in a kind of market, right? And so these are just their marketing strategies. These are the ways that they are navigating the market of the homeless world. So maybe we shouldn't treat it any different than we would any other market system, right? So the people who are using their branding or their own techniques to get money from you, it's no different from what advertisers do to get money from you, right? So that was her perspective. I don't know if that answers the ought of the question, but it certainly makes sense.
Yeah, because if you're thinking about like just a company, you're more inclined to use their services or give them money when you're interacting with them more. If you never know about a company, you'll never give them your money, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so it's the same kind of thing with the homeless people. If they're not going to make any effort to market themselves, present themselves as valuable donators or donatees, then maybe we shouldn't give them any money. I don't know. I have no firm answer on this one, man.
Yeah, it's tough.
I don't know. I fucking never give money to homeless people anyways, but if I would, who would I give it to is the real question. I really think, though, that if it came down to it, I would be more inclined to give it to the people who
worked for it
nothing. No, do nothing. Yeah. Maybe just because I'm contrarian, I don't know. But it's a tough call. What would you do? Gun to your head. You have $10 that you can only spend on homeless people. Who are you going to give it to?
Probably the guy who did something for me.
Mm-hmm.
Or who was like banging his little paint can with the drumsticks. I'd be more inclined to do that. Yeah, see, they're making an honest effort, right? They're not trying to manipulate you specifically. They're trying to present something to the public that would then get them money. I'm actually all for that. Set up a Patreon for him.
Get their PayPal and their Venmo. And
he has one of those little like credit card attachments to his phone.
Yes, dude. Oh God. I don't know, man. I don't know. So yeah, that's what I was thinking about not too long ago. Fucking homeless people. Again, I should be thinking about how to get money to them, but I don't exactly have money to spare. So yeah. Anyways, that's our first little ridiculous session. But
hopefully next time I'll be more prepared. A little more nuanced.
You got to bring something to the table next time, man.
Yeah.
Bring some sort of weird ethical dilemma or something like that. So I guess we'll get to the book. Yeah, man. This was a very difficult book to read. We both love Camus. There's no doubt.
Do you still have the same appreciation for him after reading this, or have your thoughts changed?
I don't think he's gotten any worse in my mind, that's for sure. I guess I see this in an entirely different domain than his fiction. How I feel about him as a strictly philosophical writer, my only sample for that is this book. Yeah. So coming from reading someone like Thomas Nagel, who has so much fucking depth in their philosophy and their analysis, but also has such clear writing, I would give maybe a knock to Camus for that. But I get it. He's French.
Yeah.
These French philosophers, they're like that, right? That being said, it was also very interesting to read. He's very literary in his language. When the sentences are flowing very nicely and he's making a great point, I'm so into it, man. At some points it's an absolute pleasure to read. And I bet you I would get a lot more out of it too if I had known a bit more about guys like Husserl, Jaspers, Chestov. I had never even heard of Chestov before.
Kierkegaard.
Even Kierkegaard, right? I, again, have very little familiarity with his work. Yeah, I guess like if I had known maybe a bit more about those authors that he was referencing, I would have gotten those parts I found them a bit more enjoyable. But when he's purely talking about his own reasoning, his own arguments, and he's keeping it kind of internal to the book and the absurd and what he's actually talking about, I thought some parts were absolutely excellent and a pleasure to read. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. For me, like, not knowing much about those other philosophers' like ideas really hurts. Like having doesn't help when you're trying to understand this piece. But
trying to start a philosophy podcast, and we start with the one that references the most philosophy. Oh my God, dude! Yeah. We literally jumped in the deep end, dude. The deepest of fucking ends. At the same time, this will be one of those books that I think when we finish it, we'll be very happy that that we finished it, and I'm sure we'll revisit it one day.
Yeah, for sure.
Way down the line, and we'll come back to it and be like, damn, like this is where we started, and now we'll get all the references. We'll understand all of the other philosophers named in here, and I bet you we'll be able to take a lot out of it on a second read through as well. Mm-hmm. For now, just like you said, it's like climbing that tall ass mountain, pushing that boulder. Yeah.
With Heidegger sitting on top of the rock.
Hands behind his back. Yeah, he's up there, just pondering nature and technology and looking down upon us as we struggle our way through. Yeah, man, I could read no more than 10 pages at a time with this book.
Yeah.
So I guess a good spot to start really is I think he like the intro to the book, he basically is saying that this book is not making an argument, at least this is how I understood it. It's not making an argument to try and posit that the absurd exists. I think that at the beginning of the essay, he was very much trying to say, like, let's take the fact that the absurd exists, and it exists a priori from the start of this essay. Let's take that as the starting point. Of course, he gives some examples of the absurd, but I think in that intro little abstract as the book starts, he's very much saying, like, I'm not going to try and prove to you that the absurd exists. I'm just going to take that as a given, and let's go from there. Did you get the same thing?
Yeah, like what I got out of it was he wanted to see, like, what are the consequences of it, right? I thought that was like his starting point.
Yeah, given the fact that this exists, where do we go now? Let's both go ahead and give, just in a kind of quick paragraph form, how would you describe the absurd?
I had this written down somewhere. Just give me one sec.
No problem. What I kind of understood was that us, human beings as we exist, we kind of live with this very strong desire to find meaning and search for purpose in the world. So we have, like, this is kind of something that we internally as human beings strive for and long for in our existence. And the absurd comes from that fact contradicted with the fact that there is a world out there that exists that offers us none of those things. A world that, at least as we can see it, has no meaning to offer us. Yeah. So here we are searching for this meaning in a world that, as far as we can tell, has none to offer us. And so we're basically, us living with this contradiction in our mind is what makes the absurd arise.
Yeah, for sure. I think that was spot on.
I kind of think of it as a dialectic kind of relationship. I think if you were to turn to, I have it here on page 20, Penguin Books, Great Ideas. Mine only has the myth of Sisyphus. It doesn't have the other essays.
Right.
Page 20. So I don't know where that would put you, but it's in Absurd Walls near the end of it.
Okay, right.
Let me just read a quick passage here. It says, "But what is absurd is the confrontation of the irrational and the wild longing for clarity, whose call echoes in the human heart. The absurd depends as much on man as on the world. For the moment, it is all that links them together. It binds them one to the other as only hatred can wield two creatures together." So what I took from this was that the absurd that is something that doesn't just exist within the human being and our own psyche. Instead, it exists within the relationship between our own human psyche and the world out there. So it's the relationship between these two in the kind of, dialectical. You can picture exactly the type of graph that I'm going to draw with my hands here, with one arrow pointing at the other as they feed off each other in a kind of cycle. It's that specific relationship, not just the world and not just the human psyche, that gives rise to the absurd.
He goes on to say that in Philosophical Suicide. He says something exactly like that, like the absurd lies in neither of the elements compared. it is born of their confrontation.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so I think we're both kind of on the same page. I think that the absurd is this kind of relationship between man and the world, and how irreconcilable these two things are. Mm-hmm. Do you have any kind of examples of the absurd?
Because he does give, like, I think in Philosophical Suicide, he talks about these like absurd instances, and they're like contradictory in nature, right? But I don't know.
Yes, I remember that. Right, I know exactly what you're talking about, though. He talks about the virtuous man and his desire to sleep with his cousin or something like that. Yeah. Because that, I guess he was giving so many different examples of the absurd, right? This one is the kind of juxtaposition of two like very incompatible ideas. Like you have the virtuous man on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have his like desire for incest. So these two things are kind of juxtaposed from each other, which we would say that's absolutely absurd. That's one example of the absurd, I think. I'm trying to find if there were other ones, because I very specifically remember that example. Maybe a different example of the absurd. This one's different from that kind of juxtaposition. This one's earlier on. It's on page 11. It says, "It happens that the stage set collapses."
Oh, right.
Rising tram, 4 hours in the office or factory. Meal, tram, 4 hours of work. Meal, sleep. And Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, according to the same rhythm. This path is easily followed most of the time. But one day, the why arises, and everything begins in that weariness tinged with amazement. Begins, this is important. Weariness comes at the end of the acts of a mechanical life. It awakens consciousness and provokes what follows. What follows is the gradual return into the chain, or it is the definitive awakening. So I think that this was, at least that first half, is one of those areas where I really love his writing. He really kind of gets into the monotony of the factory job. I'm immediately thinking of, remember when we read Technic by Dirk Leach in Warren Steele's class?
I think so. Oh, yeah. I remember. That's the car factory story.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. The investigative journalist.
Yeah.
He checked himself into a Mercedes production line for months at a time. Yeah, for some reason I remember that a lot. But there it is. Like, there is a person living their routine mechanical lifestyle, and it is not until the end of those acts, when he decides to reflect upon his mechanical life, that he then becomes confronted with the absurdity of his life. Because here are all these things that I'm doing. Why the hell am I doing them? Where is this purpose? Yeah, so there he becomes confronted with this kind of meaninglessness. Yeah, so I think that's another kind of form of the absurd that we can become confronted with.
It was kind of funny how he alluded to Sartre, but he didn't even mention him because they were like fighting, right?
Is this book post feud for them?
I don't know, because he writes. He doesn't even mention his name, but he says, "This discomfort in the face of man's own inhumanity, this incalculable tumble before the image of what we are, this nausea, as a writer of today calls it, is also the absurd."
Yep, there's some clear Sartre right there. There you go.
But yeah, that's.
Do you think that's a shot? Do you think that's a shot at him, or just?
I think he just didn't even.
Yeah,
I don't know, because the way I read it was like, yeah, we have similar ideas, but I'm not even going to like mention him.
Not even going to engage with him, which is actually, it has to be a shot, because think of how much name dropping he does of all those other philosophers, right? And this one, he goes out of his way to specifically not.
As a writer of today.
Yeah, dude, that's harsh. Well, those two had quite the relationship. So, okay, so I have a question for you. In the passage that I read, he very much talks about the kind of mechanical lifestyle. Also, actually, very quickly, I thought that was very interesting that even after you recognize this absurdity, you kind of slowly and inevitably fall back into it again over time.
Yeah.
You may have these brief moments of realization and awakening. Okay, I've been confronted with the absurd, but at that point, you become kind of trapped. What are you then supposed to do? Which is, I guess, the crux of this whole entire book, is once you were confronted with this, how then do you act?
Yeah.
And I think that he was great to show the cycle of just falling back into it, no matter how many times you recognize that you're in the absurd.
But isn't that what he means when he says we get in the habit of living before acquiring the habits of thinking? Is that like falling back into mechanical life?
I think you're totally right. I think you're totally fucking right. Where is this written?
That was page 8. And he uses the term eluding.
Do you have the whole passage?
We get into the habit of living before acquiring the habit of thinking. In that race which daily hastens us toward death, the body maintains its irreparable lead. In short, the essence of that contradiction lies in what I shall call the act of eluding, because it is both less and more than a diversion in the Pascalian sense.
Another name drop. Pascal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, damn, dude. Damn, these fucking name drops. But no, I totally get it, though. It's that kind of cycle. And so my question for you is, at least in the passage that I read, he talked specifically about the mechanical lifestyle. So do you think that this kind of routine mechanical lifestyle is being accentuated or increased by modern technology? Like, do you think that the kind of living without being conscious of your own living, just like that passage you read, is that happening more and more in our life due to the fact that we can kind of submit ourselves to modern technology, or do you think not?
I think maybe, like everyone's obsessed with these productivity hacks and how to get work done faster. Maybe, I guess that's our way of eluding this mechanical life. But I guess you could say that, you can go on and do your fun things after work, if you're doing these like productivity hacks and all this shit. But I don't know. What do you think? True.
It's a tough one because it's very easy to place the blame on modern technology. Yeah. This is the area that we live in. It's a kind of easy scapegoat. But on the other hand, is the work that we're doing now, although upon reflection might seem equally as meaningless, is it any different than working in something like the Industrial Revolution, that era? And so what I think of immediately is Karl Marx, right? When he talks about alienation and the de-skilling of labor and the increased disconnect between a worker and the fruits of his labor. Whereas before the Industrial Revolution, you have someone who is the town shoemaker, and he makes the shoe from beginning to end, and he has a social relationship with the people in his community because everyone in the community is wearing his shoes, and he is having a relationship with them. Whatever labors they are producing, he is also interacting with and taking. Whereas I would say post-industrial revolution, where instead you have the kind of Dirkleach Technic manufacturing line of production. We have the de-skilling of labor, where there's actually no real connection between the job and the human relationships that you have, and instead you have a very de-skilled job, and you have an increased level of alienation between yourself and your work. Maybe that would contribute to an increased feeling of the absurd. I think it's definitely possible, especially when Camus talks about that kind of daily grind of going to the factory, going to the office, and eating your meal. Again, I don't think that before the Industrial Revolution I don't think the absurd simply didn't exist, but I definitely think it's easier for us to fall into that trap. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I was just thinking though, like, is work like a necessity to fall into this trap?
Yeah, that's the thing, right? It's, again, you could have a very fulfilling job where you have a great social connection with your entire community, and you can still run into the absurd. That doesn't change, right? It really hinges on that self-reflection, because even if you are doing something that's great and you're very fulfilled by, at least subjectively, you can still be confronted by the fact that there is no true purpose behind that thing. So that also kind of disproves what I just said. So it's a tough one. I don't know how I fall down on that.
But running into the absurd is not necessarily like a bad thing. I guess it's how we react to it, right?
Yeah, I guess so. That's a good transition, actually. So we've spent so much time talking about what the absurd is and examples of it. But yeah, so given the fact that the absurd exists, how is it that we act? So let's get into that. Mm-hmm. What are some of the responses that we can have?
So yeah, he talks about, are we going to get into philosophical suicide from this point, or should we?
Let's do it. But so go on.
Like, he talks about eluding, and then he mentions hope, but I don't know if that's part of philosophical suicide. Like on page 8, he mentions like eluding.
Okay, so hold on. What is the dictionary definition of eluding?
I got evade or escape.
Yeah, no, you're right. I'm getting evade or escape from danger or enemy or pursuer, or also of an achievement or something desired. So you can fail to be attained by someone. Okay, so eluding is the invariable game. The typical act of eluding. The fatal evasion that constitutes the third theme of this essay is hope. Okay,
so I guess
I don't know.
I guess that is philosophical suicide if that is the third theme, right? Because there's three themes here, right? Absurd.
I think so.
Absurdity and suicide, absurd walls, and then philosophical suicide.
I think you're right. And so I think one of the biggest reasons he goes into so much of the philosophy of these other thinkers is because he kind of touches on the fact that every single one of them in their own way kind of recognizes this contradiction, recognizes the absurd. But I think that he also says that every single one of them tries to elude this concept by thinking about it in some different way, pretending as if one side of this contradiction actually doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Or, I think he talks about Kierkegaard instead kind of turning to God as the answer. Yeah. So I think that he's calling these people out for recognizing the absurd, but then eluding, eluding their responsibility of dealing with it. Yeah, wow, this is a tough one, man. You're definitely right. He's definitely calling these people out for, he's giving them props on the one hand. These guys all are not afraid to initially confront the absurd, but at the same time, they're all kind of doing some sort of mental gymnastics to really avoid the consequences of dealing with this contradiction.
So for what I got out of it was for Chestov and Kierkegaard, they deify the absurd. From my understanding, I thought that meant we don't understand the absurd, and then I guess that's kind of like God almost, like.
Mm-hmm. They deify absurd. That's and then they talked about deifying. Did you get the sense that he called them out for the same thing with rationality too? Because he talks a lot about rationality. Oh yeah, this is the most difficult part of the essay for me to understand, man.
Yeah, so I got this quote on page 39.
39, okay.
He gives the irrational. So he, as a Kierkegaard, gives the irrational the appearance, and God the attributes of the absurd, unjust, incoherent, and incomprehensible. Since nothing is proved, everything can be proved.
So I guess this would fall on the side of you know what? No, I can't pick a side. It would have to be just. Of course, there's no meaning in the world, but maybe there is. We don't have access to it. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But what does have access to it, that is God. Maybe.
Yeah.
Again, maybe through our own human experience, we can't find that meaning, that purpose. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just seems to be outside of our own human capacities.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, this was where the essay totally became extremely difficult for me to understand, man.
I think this quote here might help us too. We're kind of jumping over the place, but on page 35, because Chestov, what I understood is Chestov kind of also deifies the absurd too, right?
Okay.
So on page 35, to Chestov, reason is useless, but there's something beyond reason. So I guess that could be like God or something to explain all this stuff that we don't know. And then he goes, to an absurd mind, reason is useless, and there is nothing beyond reason.
Right. Okay. So there you see him kind of fetishizing reason, perhaps, maybe. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, you can kind of see him, at least his tone. He's calling these people out again because maybe Chestov, in his case, yes, the absurd exists, but they're... dude, no, I don't know what I'm trying to say here. Reason is useless, but there is something beyond reason. Okay, so just maybe with Kierkegaard, maybe we don't have access to purpose and meaning in life, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Maybe it's the same kind of logic here, but sub out God and put in reason, our ability to reason.
Yeah. He also goes, I think earlier on in Philosophical Suicide, he talks about how the thoughts, or not thoughts, but how the thinking negates itself, and maybe is that this sort of negating?
Oh yes, I remember this part. He talked. Man, do you remember when he talks about Aristotle?
Oh right, yeah.
That was where it was actually quite clear to me, and I didn't highlight that spot because he taltalked about saying that the way that a universal truth kind of contradicts itself. Yeah. Right? Everything is true. Then you were also taking on the fact that this is not true. Yeah, everything is false. So there's that internal contradiction, which is why you can kind of see this through line of him railing against any sort of unifying worldview, comprehensive, unifying theory of the world, whether that be through God, through our reason, capacity for reason, any sort of belief system. He's very much railing against that because he's saying that as soon as you endorse a unifying worldview, it inevitably negates itself and contradicts itself.
Yeah.
which is why he's so insistent on us living with this contradiction of the absurd and not trying to place some theory over it or shift the frame of it, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's like, no, let's take this contradiction with us and let's carry it with us as we move forward. I wish I could find the Aristotle quote, but do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I remember reading that.
I feel actually like that was a small breakthrough for me. I feel a little bit more knowledgeable. Man, the philosophical suicide was the toughest part of this whole essay. Okay.
Did you find it?
Here's actually, no, this is a bit different, but it's still kind of in the vein of what we're talking about with rationality. This is for me on page 40. It says, it must be repeated that the reasoning developed in this essay leaves out altogether the most widespread spiritual attitude of our enlightened age, the one based on the principle that all is reason, which aims to explain the world. It is natural to give a clear view of the world after accepting the fact that it must be clear. So I think here he's calling out that universal theory that we can discover all there is about the world through our pure rational capacities, right? Because he's saying that, okay, here we are taking as a given that everything can be understood through reason and rationality, but why are we not questioning this initial premise? Why are we assuming that the world itself is something that can be figured out through any sort of capacities, whether that be rational or spiritual? And I think he calls it spiritual because he probably the people who are champions of rationality, just as they are today, science, people who champion reason, they talk as if the entire world can be figured out through the scientific method or just, I keep saying their rational capacities, but you know what I mean. But this is a fallacy, right? This is a farce. He's calling this out because they're taking on board a very core assumption that the world is something that can be figured out through these means. And that is not necessarily true. I don't know what this makes him, whether he just becomes a full relativist or not. Did you listen to the Partially Examined Life?
On Camus?
Yeah. Wes, he really liked this essay, but he pointed out the fact that Camus, challenges these unifying theories, whether, it's God or whatever it is. But he also made it very clear that Camus is not a relativist. He's not saying that there's no truth. He called him instead a skeptic. I think it's a very fine-grained distinction, but he's not saying, so I guess what I'm going to, butcher this a little bit, but Wes was trying to say that although Camus is pushing aside all of these things, it doesn't mean that he thinks that there's no answer to the question. There's no solution that doesn't involve some sort of way to find meaning in the world. He's just very skeptical of the ones that have already been proposed.
Yeah. But yeah, like he says here on page 40, I merely want to remain in this middle path where the intelligence can remain clear. It seems like he just wants to, I guess he trusts what he can see, or I guess what he can know, right?
Yeah, he's only taking on what we can absolutely know, right? He's not taking any sort of leaps of faith, whether that be a leap of faith in trusting in God or a leap of faith in trusting in reason, or any sort of all-encompassing belief system, I think. And I think that's the whole, if I understand, he is calling this act that Kierkegaard, Husserl, Jaspers, all of these philosophers are falling into. I think he's calling this kind of mental gymnastics they're doing the act of philosophical suicide. Yeah. Because they are taking these things for granted when they absolutely should not be. I have two other things that I wanted to talk about. One, this is going way back to the beginning of the book, page 6. The quote is, "In the face of such contradictions and obscurities, must we conclude that there is no relationship between the opinion one has about life and the act one commits to leave it?" So I think he's making the claim here. So many of these philosophers claim that there is no meaning in life, but they are not acting on that. Because if they were, then perhaps they would commit suicide, right? Because he mentions the one author I don't think he gives their name, who writes the entire book and then commits suicide immediately afterwards, right?
Oh yeah.
In this kind of, do you remember that?
I have in my edition. There's like a little what's that word for when there's
footnote?
Yeah, I have heard of an emulator of Peregrinos, post-war writer who, after having finished his first book, committed suicide to attract attention to his work. Attention was in fact attracted, but the book was judged no good. Sucks.
You're right. No, I found the footnote too. That's hilarious, man. Yeah, of course. Never heard of this guy before. His little strategy did not work. So the reason I bring this quote up, though, is kind of a more broad question that's not necessarily strictly to do with the act of suicide or this essay itself, but more between the connection between what one philosophically professes and what one actually acts out in the world, right? Should there be a relationship between these two things? Does it really matter if someone is proclaiming, if a philosopher is proclaiming one thing but not necessarily acting it out in the world? Does the idea itself become void or not?
But keep in mind, on the first page, he says, and if it is true, as Nietzsche claims, that a philosopher, to deserve respect, must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply.
So it seems as if Nietzsche believes that there should be a connection between these two things. Yeah. And if you believe something, you definitely should act on it to be a good philosopher, I guess. It's a tough one. I feel very conflicted about it. I don't know. Do you remember Peter Singer, right?
Yeah.
I think I'm very much thinking about his philosophy of effective altruism, and we ought to give up X amount of our dollars to save lives, right? It's a very small sacrifice for us to save so many lives. The imperative, the onus is on us to do something like that. Mm-hmm. And he's someone that actually acts that out, right? He will go ahead and give X amount of dollars to buy malaria bug nets for people in Africa, and he's actively saving lives. And I don't know if you remember his metaphor of the shallow pond, his thought experiment.
How does that one go again?
So it's a kind of guy who just gets back from the shopping mall. He's bought himself a nice new pair of shoes. They cost him $200. And on the way home, he walks past a shallow pond, and he sees a young child drowning in the pond. And so the question becomes, does he sacrifice the brand new shoes that he just bought for $200 to go and save the child that's drowning right in front of him? And of course, the answer is yes, absolutely. I'm sure you'd agree with that. But then he then kind of extends this to be like, well, there are people who are dying every single day that we can save with a dollar amount that just are not as close in proximity to us. So why is it that we have the imperative to act in the shallow pond case, but not in the malaria bug net case? So he very much believes that we should act impartially in both of these situations, and that's why he gives up so much of his income to try and save these people by buying them bug nets. So he's an example of a philosopher that acts out what he preaches, right? Yeah. It's basically do you practice what you preach. But at the same time, if he didn't do that, if he didn't donate all of this money to these great charities that are saving these people, would that make his ideas void? Would it make his ideas any less valuable? And personally, I think no.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's a tough one. It doesn't have to be specifically to this example either. Like any sort of belief that you have, or any sort of great idea that a thinker has, why is the truth or falsity of that statement or that profession contingent on whether or not they acted it out?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? Because
your gut reaction says, yeah, they should, practice what they preach, but does it even matter if they do it? Right?
I definitely think that the idea has value in itself, whether or not the individual who had the idea acts it out. Because I think that there should be a degree of separation between the idea and the individual, right? So again, that was a kind of a more broad question, but it kind of relates to the essay, right? If these philosophers are making the conclusion that there is no meaning in life and that there is no purpose and what the hell are we doing here, why are they not the ones acting out their beliefs and committing suicide, right? Which kind of leads me, sorry, go on.
But that's why they turn to their philosophical suicide, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's their out. That's their excuse, right? which is what I think Camus is trying to call them all out on.
Yeah. What I kind of struggled with, but I guess maybe it's in the next chapter, is like how does the absurd man, I guess, live his life, Like what are the benefits of living like an absurd man?
At least from what I understand, at least from the Partially Examined Life podcast, he gets into that a lot more in the second half of the book.
Right.
So we might have a bit more information on that the next time we record, because you're right. He's very much diagnosing the problem, but he's not necessarily offering much of a prescription in terms of how to act, other than, I don't know if you remember, this is near the end of the first half where he talks about quantity of life being very important.
Yeah.
Which I don't know what you got out of that. He was very much, I had never heard anything like this, but he talked about the quantity of life being even more important than the quality of it.
Yeah, that confused me because normally you would think that quality is more important.
Yeah, I would think it's a no-brainer, right? Did you get a sense of his actual argument as to why? I was having a really hard time understanding. Quantity of life is something that we should be striving for. The quantity of experience being a good in itself.
There's this one paragraph on page 61 he says, the most living in the broadest sense. That rule means nothing. It calls for definition. It seems to begin with the fact that the notion of quantity has not been sufficiently explored. That paragraph.
Okay, so he's kind of setting up the argument to take it down, I think. For it can account for a large share of human experience. A man's rule of conduct and his scale of values have no meaning except through the quantity and variety of experiences he has been in a position to accumulate.
He mentions on page 62, but again, it is the absurd and its contradictory life that teaches us. And then he goes on, two men living the same number of years, the world always provides the same number of experiences. It is up to us to be conscious of them. Being aware of one's life, one's revolt, one's freedom, and to the maximum is living, and to the maximum.
I think that maybe when he's talking about quantity, he's talking about kind of being, I don't know, I don't want to sound so cliche, right? But being present in like being actually conscious, right? Not just being on the kind of default setting of the factory mechanical life that we talked about earlier, where he talks about these two men. One never takes a moment to reflect upon his mechanical lifestyle, never becomes confronted with the absurd, never questions it, and never acts in a way in response to that realization. Whereas the other one does make that realization and then instead tries to make the most of his current experience by filling it with variety and novelty and all of these things. So although these two might be living the exact same amount of time, quote unquote, one is actually getting a much greater quantity of experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, that makes sense, because then he goes on later on page 63. The present and the succession of the presence before a constantly conscious soul is the ideal of the absurd man. So, yeah.
Okay, so I think that, I guess he's maybe saying like the recognition of the absurd is contributing to that kind of consciousness as opposed to unconsciousness. And when I say unconsciousness, I don't mean anesthetic or sleeping. I mean just that kind of mechanical default setting, unpresent lifestyle. So if that's the case that he's making, then I actually agree with him that quantity is a good thing. Okay, that's quite interesting, actually. It's tough, though, because remember earlier, you even though you recognize the absurd, you very slowly you can fall back into the same thing a number of times, right? So hopefully he has some sort of prescriptive measures for not falling into it as often, or recognizing when you have fallen into it, or how to create that kind of quantity or variety or novelty in your life. I mean, the only thing I can think of really is, again, cliche, but it's meditation, right? But meditation has been very helpful for me, not just during the act of meditating, but later on in the day, kind of waking the hell up and being conscious and aware of what the hell's going on around you.
Yeah, for sure. Like you just mentioned, like constantly kind of waking yourself up almost. He uses, on page 54, I wrote down in my notebook, revolt is the constant confrontation between man and his own obscurity. The revolt gives life its value. So, yeah. Yeah,
I think so. So maybe the act of revolt is doing your best to not fall back into that mode, and instead, once you recognize that, once you recognize the absurd, carry it with you at all times. Keep it present in your mind as you act throughout the world at all times, and don't suppress it or pretend as if it doesn't exist. You keep it present and use it to your advantage. That is your revolt, right? That could become your own purpose in its own way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. Like, don't run from it, and don't kill yourself.
There's this is kind of a tangent, I guess, but I read the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and in it, he talks about a Nietzsche quote: "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." So Frankl was using it in the context of these people in the concentration camp who, although they have everything taken away from them, they have that why to live, that purpose that they have found. And so because they have that why, it doesn't matter what happens to them, they can hold on to this, and that will get them through. And so I think it's kind of parallel to this act of revolt, right? The act of revolting against the absurd could be your why. And once you have that why, whatever life throws at you, you can confront it. And maybe that is Sisyphus rolling that boulder up the hill. He's choosing his own mentality in his given circumstance, right? He has his own why. So it doesn't matter what the how is. It doesn't matter that he has to push this fucking boulder up the hill over and over again. He has that raison d'etre, right? The reason for being. And because he hangs on to it, whatever circumstances around him don't have power over him because he is revolting.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay. Well, I'm sure that they'll get more into that. Camus will get more into that later on in the essay. There's still no mention of Sisyphus yet. Like halfway through the fucking book. Camus
taking
his time.
Is that a different essay altogether? Or is that the last chapter in this?
The last chapter. So again, in Partially Examined Life, they talk about the myth of Sisyphus existing in its book form like this, but also just a 7-page essay that is also just assigned in intro to philosophy classes, just a 7-page essay. So once we approach this final myth of Sisyphus essay, we'll be well prepared, I guess. I hope. This is just kind of a similar side thought. This is page 10 for me. It says, "There is a moral to it. It teaches that a man defines himself by his make-believe as well as by his sincere impulses." So we kind of define ourselves in two ways. It's defined how we are now, how we are acting now, and our ideal selves, how we want to act or how we ought to act. And so this is something that we kind of take on board in everything that we think about, whether that's, something as simple as your diet, right? How you are acting in the moment versus how your ideal self would act. It seems to be universal that we think of ourselves in this way and think about the ways that it affects how we act, and it affects our values as well. There's a clear distinction between how things are and how things ought to be. This is something that we think about all the time. And so I think values arise from our act of answering the question of how things ought to be. Right? This is where our values come up. How do you feel about this? Do you think about things this way, as between the kind of divided, coalesced self, or not?
This quote kind of reminds me of the whole bad faith by Sartre.
Okay.
The make believe thing.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. Yeah, and also you could think of like Judith Butler's performativity too,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Like, how is it that we actually are? How is it that we're performing? Or how is it that we think we ought to act in a given situation? Why is it that we make this distinction in almost everything that we do? Like I said, it can really be anything. Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this, but there's some connections to be had there. Mm-hmm. That exhausts all my notes, dude. I don't know if you have anything else.
I was just going to say, like, I don't know where I'm going with this either, but like maybe it's because existentialism, like choosing how you want to behave and choosing who you want to be, is just way more challenging than just, oh, I'm this person and that's how it is, Yeah,
I think that existentialism has helped me kind of realize a lot of my own autonomy, untapped autonomy, right? In the way that you can really will into existence the kind of person that you want to be, or the kinds of things that you want to do, or things that you want to bring about in the world. We have these capacities, and it's just a matter of willing them into existence, right? Mm-hmm. Certainly not an easy process, but once you realize that it's possible, you can become kind of emancipated from things like the social situation that you're in, or the hierarchical role that your familial unit or your culture says that you have to play or fall into. Once you realize that this is possible, you can kind of, to the best of your abilities, arise above it and do your best to act in the world in a way that you see fit, not a way that the world sees fit for you. Mm-hmm. Any other closing thoughts?
I think that's it. Like I have a much better understanding of that revolt now, after we talked it out.
Yeah, for me as well. I think that, again, I'm certainly not there yet, but I have a little bit of a better understanding of what he's trying to do when he's talking about these other philosophers as well, in the ways that he's praising them, in the ways that he's calling them out, the way that Camus is kind of revolting against a unifying theory, and his desire for us to keep this contradiction of the absurd condition of man in mind at all times. Mm-hmm. And so once we do that, how do we act? I'm hoping for more answers in the second half of this book. Whether or not they come, we'll find out. Dude, this was fucking great.
Yeah, like time just flew by. I'm looking at the clock, the little timer thing.
Yeah, we're at 80 minutes. Oh my God, dude, it's crazy.
What do you like moving forward? What do you think we should do? Should we try like a different book and then maybe return to these chapters later, or should we press on?
Oh man, that's a tough one. I would stagger. I would actually be down to stagger, but I do want to finish this book.
Yeah.
But this was an absolute fucking boulder up the hill. There's no doubt. So to space it out with something else,
I think that would help.
I would be totally down.
I think I don't know if you might add might even help us understand this too, like moving forward if we bounce around a bit. But I'd be down to do a short story too.
Yeah, send me a short story, and then whatever it is, I'll print it off. We'll read it.
All right.
So fuck yeah, man. Well done. Well, I guess let's end it here, and then if you need me, just text me.
Okay. Have a good night.
Peace out, dude. Likewise.